You may recognize me from such presentations as how our standards work together and phishing-resistant authentication. Right now, I'm here to talk about mobile payments and how we have evolved our mobile payment standards. Evolving them was a lot of work. It's kind of put me out of breath at the moment. But looking back in history to where we were, POIs, the things we used for accepting payments in a face-to-face context, they weren't called POIs at that point, back 20 years ago. They were called PEDs, Pin Entry Device. And they were used for pin entry. Now, they might have had a card swipe, they might have had an EMV slot. If they did have a contact slot for a chip card, chances are they didn't have the actual level 2 EMV kernel in there back at that time. We had a standard for that, and that standard was PCI PED. Now, those devices evolved over time, and they evolved into more complex systems because payments changed from something that is a function in and of itself, accepting payments, to something that is a facilitator of other functions and processes. Payments became an underlying technology that people wanted to build stuff on top of. And you had multifunction PEDs at that point, so multifunction pin entry devices that were more complex, could run applications, these sorts of things. And they evolved into touch entry devices, still physically secure, tamper-resistant devices, but they provided multiple applications. They provided a touch entry interface, perhaps, that you could enter your PIN in. And then there's also the other angle they evolved into, which was just essentially a card reader, just something that you would tap your card on, swipe your card on, insert your card into, that provided the encrypted data to something else. So we have a standard for that, which is PCI PTS POI. So this is the point where we evolved from PEDs into POIs as point of interaction, recognizing the fact they're not just for pin entry anymore, they do more things. However, that simple PED evolved in a different way as well. And that different way is into mobile payments, where you would take something like a phone or a tablet or something like that, and you would have the cardholder account data directly entered into that device, either as a PIN, potentially, using an external reader, so they'd interface through to the POI systems to accept the actual data off the card, or potentially taking both the PIN and the account data on that mobile device itself, the PIN through the touchscreen, the account data through the NFC interface of the phone or the tablet. So we have standards for that, and those standards are SPoC, CPoC, and MPoC. MPoC being essentially the evolution of the previous standards of SPoC and CPoC. So MPoC was first released back in November of 2022. The security requirements in the program guide came out at that time. We have had technical FAQs that come out regularly that help clarify the items within those standards. We also released an update to MPoC 1.0 as 1.0.1 in February of 2023. It essentially just fixed some typographical errors and those sorts of things in there. However, we are getting feedback, and we have been getting feedback from the marketplace, from our stakeholders, of people saying, you know what, it's great, but it could be better. There are things you could do within this standard that aren't permitted at the moment that we would like you to take a look at. So what are those things? So feedback we were getting on version 1.0.1 of MPoC is that the laboratory testing of applications is too burdensome. In version 1.0.1 and version 1 before it, you could have what we refer to as an MPoC SDK that implemented all of the payments features, all of the security features that could be then contained within an MPoC application. An MPoC application could integrate that MPoC SDK And in version 1.0 and 1.0.1, that MPoC application still had to be assessed by a laboratory. And the intent there was that, you know what, we don't want people adding new features to the application to do payments, because the intent is the MPoC SDK does everything. And you also wanted to make sure that it was integrated correctly with the whole A&M environment and so forth. We also being asked for increased support for different types of POI devices. In version 1.0, 1.0.1, we supported a type of POI called an SCRP, or a secure card reader pin, designed specifically for attaching to a mobile device and providing potentially pin translation features. Won't get into the details, just to say it was very specifically a card reading device, and that's it. We're getting feedback that people wanted to have different types of POI devices that could connect to a mobile device, read cards, have potentially the pin entered on the mobile phone, or maybe just use the mobile phone as a conduit for transmitting data from the terminal, but you know what, also being able to accept payment data on that mobile phone as well in the context of a single kind of user interface or user experience. We had people feeding back that the MPoC product types that we supported were limited. And so I'll get to this a little bit later on, but basically there were 3 different things that we would list on an MPoC list. There's an MPoC software, which was all of the software aspects, the technical aspects, these sorts of things. There was an MPoC A&M service, attestation and monitoring service, that would provide operational features to some aspects of that MPoC software that provides security around the environment in which the MPoC application and SDK execute. And then there's an MPoC solution that could roll all of that up. People wanted to mix and match those a little bit. There were some constraints. For example, you needed to have an MPoC software product listed before you could have an MPoC A&M system listed, and then the A&M system didn't really contain some of the features that people wanted before they got to a full solution. People were telling us that some of the requirements weren't necessary. They were too burdensome. There were things that we were asking that weren't suited to the threat model that was being addressed. Some of the key management items were too strict, for example. And we have an ongoing conversation around the definition of COTS. If you've ever seen me present on MPoC before, I will always talk about the definition of COTS. It's an item that comes up a lot. But the intent of MPoC was for originally, the intent of SPoC and CPoC, originally for mobile phones. In that slide where I talked about the evolution, these standards have evolved as well. The use of them has evolved. And so we're being asked to evolve our definition of COTS at the same time. So we said, we've heard you. We hear what you're saying, but you know what? We want to make sure that we're hearing as much of the industry as we possibly can. So we set up a schedule of meetings between people from principal participating organizations and people who are on what we have as the Mobile Task Force, which is made up of other PO members. And across the course of May, June, July, and August, we had a series of meetings, both in parallel with the RFC. You can see that little blue, I guess, box that goes across from May 20th to June 20th. That was the RFC period for version 1.1. So we had meetings with our stakeholders in parallel with that, as well as after that, and we were asking people, what is it that you want from this new standard? How can we best update this? Please give us information in the RFC. We still want that, but we also want to have a conversation with you at the same time as we're updating this standard. We don't want this to be a, thanks for your feedback, you'll hear from us in a couple of months, here's the new standard. We wanted to be vetting the ideas and thoughts that were going into the standard as we developed it. A stable version of MPoC 1.1 was then provided back to some of these participants to validate that it was hitting the mark, it was correct, it was something that needed to be released in that form. The RFC itself was very successful. We had about 400 items of feedback. Once again, this is in addition to the meetings that we ran at the same time. So there's other items of feedback that we're getting, potentially reinforcing these ones, but potentially different from those items of feedback as well. Here, this graph shows groupings of feedback that we were getting in terms of the different columns, and the different colors different companies who provided that type of feedback. This lets us kind of take a step back and look at, okay, well, we're receiving a lot of feedback on one item. Obviously, clearly that needs to be addressed. But we're also receiving less feedback on this other item. But you know what? Every single RFC participant is making a note on that item. That's obviously also important. Most of the items were wording, things that needed to be either changed because the wording wasn't clear, things where potentially there were still typos in there, those sorts of items, but a lot of the other items that I've already talked through as well. So we have gone through that process and produced a disposition for MPoC version 1.1, and it's not quite finished yet. It's pretty close. It is pretty close. And we've managed to address over 2/3 of the feedback directly that we received. There's about 20% of it that was not adopted at this time. But even for those not adopted items, we have included guidance, we have included further items, perhaps clarifications and so forth, perhaps even new requirements to help clarify what is required in that context. I'm happy to say, this is the first time I'm talking about this publicly, we are looking now to release MPoC version 1.1 during the course of this year. So that new version is going to be coming out this year. So what is changing in that new version? Basically all the things that I just spoke about. All those items that I said we were getting feedback on, we have managed to address almost all of those items, if not all of them. I talked about the application integration being burdensome in terms of coming back to the laboratory. Well, you know what? We've addressed that. What we're saying now is if you're a vendor who has an MPoC software product or an MPoC service, I'll get to that later on, that has an MPoC SDK, you can have that MPoC SDK integrated into an application and validate that application yourself, as long as you meet some criteria. It's not a free pass. You need to make sure you've got processes and technologies and ability to do that validation. But if you can do that, then we support that within MPoC version 1.1. We also support the ability to take one SDK and have that integrated into another MPoC SDK. So you can build on top of each other. Now, there's a limit to how often you can do that because it gets very complex very quickly, but it allows for implementations where you have one type of technology supported, maybe NFC, and you know what, you want to add a POI or something externally to that with another SDK, you can integrate those two features together. We have introduced new MPoC products into this line. So what was the A&M service, we've just generically now called a service. And that gives us flexibility to include different scope within that. A&M service is still part of it, but you can have an A&M service and essentially payment processing in there as well, and that makes adding on a final solution much easier. It allows for easier, what we might refer to as white labeling of solutions. You can also have an MPoC SDK that doesn't implement a secure channel. I won't get into the technical details here. If you know what I'm talking about, you know, where the secure channel is implemented by the application. And so that allows some flexibility when you are talking potentially to different payment backends within an overall MPoC solution. We've removed the secure software validation requirement for the A&M backend. That was one item that a lot of people were telling us was overly burdensome. We've integrated all of the existing FAQs that we have for version 1.0.1 into the version 1.1 so that you don't have to be referring to the FAQs at this point. I expect more technical FAQs will be coming out. The ones we have now, we have integrated. And finally, we have updated the definition of COTS. It is, it's a little bit more flexible than it has been previously. So what does all this mean? So in this picture here, the differences are a little bit subtle, and I'll get to some of those subtle differences initially, but what we can see here are some of the changes. So in MPoC version 1.1, you can have the PIN being entered into the COTS device, but also into the POI. Now, we couldn't support that in version 1.0.1 because it was an SCRP, and the SCRPs don't have keypads. So we allow for that, and there's certain things that need to be done and need to be supported in the standard to allow for that. We also have the ability to support those different POIs. So different support, it's not an SCRP anymore, it is a POI on that device. you can integrate multiple SDKs as well. So what about product types? So in this picture, I've got an overview, high-level items of what is in an MPoC product, or could be in an MPoC product. You've got the software that exists on the COTS device, let's call it COTS software. You have the software that exists in the back-end environment that performs the attestation and monitoring of that COTS environment. Let's call that the attestation and monitoring software. You have certain procedures and protocols and methodologies that need to exist in terms of vulnerability management and key management. You have the attestation and monitoring service itself. You need to have some sort of payment processing environment. We're going to call that a payment switch for now. And then you have the actual applications that exist that are being used by end merchants to accept payments. So in version 1.0.1, version 1 before it as well, you could have what we call a monolithic MPoC solution, which is where you say, you know what, we do everything. No need to break this up into different components, different products on a list. We do the whole thing, so you can have that. You could have the acquirers integrated into that, or not, as long as it includes anything that has a cryptographic relationship with the SDK or the application that's actually doing the encryption of cardholder data and pins and so forth. But in version 1.0.1, you'd also have an MPoC software product that could include an MPoC application, must include an MPoC SDK, and has some aspects of vulnerability management and key management. You have the A&M service, as I've mentioned, and then you could build a solution on top of those products. So what we've done in version 1.1 is we've said, okay, the existing ways we did things weren't necessarily broken, but we want to expand them a little bit. So you can still have an MPoC software product that's essentially the same thing as it was in version 1.0.1. And you can have an A&M service that is essentially the same as the thing you had in version 1.0.1. But you know what? You can have an MPoC A&M service that also includes MPoC software. So you don't need to have the software listing first and then have the A&M service, because essentially you're providing both the software and the A&M service together, and that was a common thing that people were asking us. So we support that in version 1.1. You can also have an A&M service that includes the MPoC software product, it includes the actual A&M service, and it includes the payment switch and the MPoC applications to some extent that are being used with that. You can integrate these things in different ways, but you do need an MPoC solution to wrap up everything. We allow for the MPoC solution at the end of the day there, and that could be something that incorporates, once again, just that switch or essentially the acquiring institutions as well. This allows, as I said, for more simple white labeling and so forth. So I mentioned SDKs earlier, and I've talked about SDKs a little bit. So how does that work? So in version 1.0.1, we did allow for an MPoC application to integrate two SDKs, but they had to be separate. So you could do that, as I said, one might support the contactless NFC interface on the phone, as shown in SDK 1, and you might have SDK 2 that supports an external device. That's fine. We still support that in version 1.1, but what we do allow now is for that one SDK, SDK 1, to be integrated into a secondary SDK, SDK 2. Now, they might still have separate payment backends, separate A&M backends. There's complexity here that makes this complex because they might have been developed by different entities, and that needs to be accommodated for. But equally, you might have something where there's one there's one A&M that is being supported because these features might be provided by a completely integrated MPoC software product, or they might be provided in a way where there is a separate A&M service that supports both MPoC software products, and so there's only one A&M backend. Still need to have a payment implementation in there as well. But you know what? You could also have an SDK that is not doing additional payment functions. Sounds a little bit complex. Let me give you an example here. So you might have, for example, somebody who wants to support in something that is listed as an MPoC product, the ability to read transport tickets, contactless transport tickets on the back of their phone. Now, that's not a payment in the context of what we talk about, but it is an NFC interface. But you know what? The people who want to do that, probably the people who run the transport functions within that particular geolocation, they're not payments people. So what they might want to do is take an MPoC SDK that does payments, put on top of that the features that they want that read, for example, NFC cards. They don't do payments, but they're reading a card, and then that might talk to a non-payment backend. All the payments are being processed by an MPoC SDK that is integrated. That whole thing could still be listed on an MPoC listing. So I mentioned vendor validation and the fact that people were seeing it as being a little bit too burdensome to have the MPoC application go through lab testing at all times. Hopefully you can see this looks a little bit small on the picture I've got down here. But there are examples where you must still go through lab testing. If you are adding new payment features, if you are, for example, integrating things in a more complex way, you still need to go through lab testing. There are examples where vendor testing will work. If you're only adding functionality that has no impact on any of the MPoC requirements, you're not doing anything with actual payments, you're not doing anything except maybe rebranding, supporting transport tickets, that sort of thing, then that could be something that could be validated by the vendor of MPoC SDK 1. And then, we've got some middle ground, and as always, there's going to be an area which is gray where I have to say it depends, and it's going to be implemented depending on exactly what you're doing there. Ultimately, if it is something that does not impact the requirements for MPoC, then it can be validated through vendor testing, that integration. If it's something that does impact the requirements for MPoC, then it must be validated through lab testing. So that's where that all gets scooped up there. So what are the next steps here? So as I mentioned, we are moving ahead with version 1.1. We do expect for that to be released this year. It is going through the process for finalization and release. There's things we need to do to make sure that all the I's and T's are dotted there. Expect publication later this year. I can't commit to a date beyond sometime before December 31st. We're also working on the programmatic aspects of this. So obviously, as we change the standard, the program guide, the reporting documents, these sorts of things need to change as well. However, MPoC is not everything. Now, this is actually a picture of me before I shaved this morning. I'm a very, very hairy man. But MPoC is something that we are working on with a specific use case in terms of accepting payments from a merchant environment using their COTS device. But there are other ways you can implement SDKs as well. And we're working on an SDK module for the Secure Software Standard as part of the update to that standard. If you were here yesterday morning listening to the presentation I gave on how we're evolving our standards, then I talked about the fact that we're updating secure software, and there was in one of those pictures an indication to the SDK module there as well. So I'm going to end here and just note once again, you're probably sick of hearing this, but I want to thank everybody for the input that we received over this process, whether you were involved in the RFC, whether you were involved in the meetings that we held. If you weren't and you want to be, I want to extend an arm to you and say we need your feedback to make these standards better. We need to know what people need in these standards, what people want in these standards, and we need a breadth of input to make sure we're listening to all of our constituents to make sure that our standards are the most appropriate they can be. This picture that I've got up here, everything you see in red here on that slide, that is an indication of a change that has been made from version 1.0.1 of MPoC to version 1.1. Every one of those items of red, be it crossed out or added, has been originated from feedback we got from you. If you see this new standard and you say, you know what, it's great, it could be better, we need to hear from you still, because we are continuing to evolve our standards, and the only way we do that and make things better is with everybody's involvement. So thank you very much.